In the summer of 1967, the United States Army's most decorated Airborne Brigade is ordered into the Central Highlands of Vietnam. Backed by artillery, air support, and the confidence of 2 years fighting Viet Cong guerrillas near Saigon, the 173rd Airborne Brigade expects to sweep the mountains around Dak To and crush whatever NVA units are hiding there. Instead, across 6 months of fighting on jungle-covered ridgelines, the Sky Soldiers discover that their enemy has chosen the ground, built the bunkers, and is waiting for them to walk in. By the time it's over, the 173rd will lose a fifth of its total strength, earn a presidential unit citation, and get pulled from the line as combat ineffective. The whole arc plays out in less than 6 months. The 173rd had arrived in Vietnam in May 1965, the first major Army ground combat unit in the country. For 2 years, they'd operated in the lowlands around Saigon, in War Zone D, the Iron Triangle, places where the Viet Cong planted booby traps, triggered ambushes, and melted back into the villages. The Sky Soldiers were good at that fight. They were aggressive, mobile, and fast. In February of '67, the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, made the only combat parachute jump of the entire war during Operation Junction City, dropping into War Zone C near the Cambodian border. They had swagger, and they had reason for it. What they didn't have was experience against NVA regulars, and the distinction mattered more than anyone in the brigade seemed to appreciate. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the terrain. To core, the Central Highlands, was nothing like the lowlands around Saigon. Western Kontum province was covered by double and triple canopy jungle, so thick that air support couldn't find targets, and artillery observers couldn't adjust fire. The only open ground was choked with bamboo, stalks as thick as 8 inches in diameter. The mountains belonged to whoever dug in first, and the NVA had been digging in for months. The 4th Infantry Division, based out of Pleiku under Major General William Pearce, had been running into heavier and heavier contact across the province. NVA units were pushing into the tri-border area where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia met, staging operations against Special Forces camps at Dak To and Ben Het. Pearce asked for reinforcements. Westmoreland sent the 173rd. Before the brigade deployed, Pearce operations officer, Colonel William Livesey, tried to warn the airborne officers. The NVA up here weren't irregulars. They were trained, equipped, dug in, and motivated. He told them that PVN regulars were a much better force than the VC. These warnings, as it turned out, made little impression on the paratroopers. On June 17, 1967, 2 battalions of the 173rd Airborne Brigade under Brigadier General John Dean moved into the Dak To area as part of Operation Greeley. The mission was standard Westmoreland doctrine: search and destroy, sweep the jungle-covered mountains, find the NVA, fix them, and kill them. The 4th Division's officers, who'd been fighting in these mountains for months and had already learned what the terrain could do to good units, didn't hide their skepticism. The paratroopers from the lowlands hadn't earned that lesson yet. On June 20th, Charlie Company's 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, moved onto Hill 1338, the dominant hill mass south of Dak To. What they found should have stopped everything cold: the bodies of a Special Forces CIDG patrol that had gone missing 4 days earlier. These were experienced indigenous fighters led by American advisors, and the NVA had wiped them out on this very ground. The next day, Alpha Company, 2 503rds, set up a night defensive position halfway up the north face of 1338. They could hear movement in the jungle around them. The following morning, June 22nd, Captain David Milton led the company back down the ridge toward Dak To. 2nd Lieutenant Jeffrey Sexton had his 1st platoon near the front of the column. The jungle was thick enough that visibility dropped to a few meters. At 0658, the lead squad walked into the kill zone. The 6th Battalion, 24th NVA Regiment, hit them from the front, and both flanks. AK-47 fire ripped through the vegetation from every direction. Milton radioed for artillery. The canopy was so thick the forward observers couldn't adjust fire. He called for air support. F-100s couldn't find targets through triple canopy. Gunships couldn't distinguish friendly lines from enemy positions. Charlie Company got the order to move up in support. The terrain made it nearly impossible. They fought to close the distance, while Alpha Company absorbed wave after wave. What happened next reveals the nature of the enemy the 173rd was now facing. The NVA didn't just fire on Alpha Company, they overran positions. They moved through the wounded. Of the 76 men killed, 43 had fatal close-range head wounds. The NVA executed American paratroopers as they lay on the ground. 137 men went up that ridge. 76 came back dead, 23 more wounded. A sweep of the battlefield afterward turned up 15 NVA bodies. Westmoreland's headquarters in Saigon reported the number as 475 enemy killed. When staff officers questioned the figure, Westmoreland reportedly said it was too late. The number had already gone out. As with so much of the body count system across Vietnam, the official report bore little relation to reality. The 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry from the 1st Air Cavalry Division came in on June 23rd. ARVN airborne battalions followed. Operation Greeley continued through the summer and fall, but the worst was still 5 months away. The Central Highlands had negated every advantage the Sky Soldiers carried. Speed, mobility, firepower, air superiority, all of it was blunted by terrain, canopy, and an enemy who chose where to fight, dug in deep, and waited. This was a problem the US military would face repeatedly in Vietnam. Helicopter mobility and overwhelming firepower could dominate open terrain and set-piece battles. But under triple canopy, in steep mountains, against an entrenched enemy who initiated contact and withdrew before the full weight of American ordnance could be brought to bear, the tactical equation shifted dramatically. Pierce had already figured this out. He'd ordered the 4th Infantry to move in battalion-sized elements, never letting companies operate more than a kilometer apart. The 173rd took the loss on 1338 and kept operating the same way they always had. On August 23, 1967, Brigadier General Leo Schweiter took command of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Schweiter had serious credentials. He jumped with the 101st at Normandy, fought at Market Garden and Bastogne. He'd commanded the 5th Special Forces Group, but he was about to command a brigade in the worst terrain in Vietnam, against the best enemy forces in the country. By late October, intelligence painted a clear picture. NVA units in the tri-border region had been reinforced and reorganized into the 1st NVA Division. Their mission, according to captured documents and a key defector, was to take Dak To and destroy a brigade-sized American unit. 4 NVA regiments were in the area: the 24th, the 32nd, the 66th, and the 174th. Thousands of well-supplied, well-trained regulars on ground they'd been fortifying for months. The NVA had newer Soviet and Chinese equipment, including AK-47s, RPDs, and recoilless rifles. And they had something the Americans couldn't match in this terrain. They had patience, and they had the ability to choose the moment of contact. But this NVA buildup was not happening in isolation. The border battles developing at Dak To, Con Thieu, Loc Ninh, and Song Bi were all part of a larger North Vietnamese strategy, one that Hanoi understood and MACV did not. The North Vietnamese were pulling American combat power away from the cities and lowlands and pinning it along the borders. At the tactical level, US commanders saw enemy formations to be destroyed. At the strategic level, Hanoi saw American battalions being drawn exactly where it wanted them. The Americans didn't fully understand the purpose of this until it was far too late. On November 1, 1967, Operation MacArthur kicked off, bringing the 173rd back into the Dak To area alongside the 4th Infantry Division, the 1st Air Cavalry, and ARVN forces. Dak To had become a major logistical base, supporting an entire US division, an airborne brigade, and 6 ARVN battalions. November 2nd, a recon patrol from the 173rd made contact. Brief firefight. 1 American killed. November 6th, in the Ngok Kom Layat chain of hills south of Ben Het, all 4 companies of the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry hit NVA defensive positions. 4 hours of fighting, 16 Sky Soldiers killed, 37 wounded. The NVA fought from bunker complexes built to absorb exactly the kind of firepower the Americans brought. Then came Veterans Day, November 11th, 1967. The 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, had already fought for Hill 823 days earlier, when Bravo Company combat assaulted onto the hilltop by helicopter to build fire support base. 15. 120 men against an entrenched enemy. Bravo took the hill but paid 9 dead and 28 wounded. The next morning, Lieutenant Colonel David Schumacher's 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry, relieved Bravo and split into 2 task forces against the explicit advice of Colonel Livesey, who'd been warning about exactly this kind of dispersion since June. Task Force Black, made up of Charlie Company and 2 platoons from Delta Company, roughly 170 men, left the hilltop to hunt the NVA, who'd fought Bravo. They followed an NVA communications wire running alongside a trail. A white pith helmet turned up. Fresh, bare footprints in the dirt. Every indicator said the enemy was close. At 0828, following the commo wire deeper into the jungle, they walked into the 8th and 9th Battalions of the 66th NVA Regiment. The ambush was textbook. Let the point element pass, then hit the column from the front and both flanks simultaneously. 8 hours of fighting, 20 killed, 154 wounded, 2 missing. Out of 170 men, almost everyone in the force was hit. During the fighting, Private First Class John Barnes of Charlie Company took over a machine gun after its crew was killed. He knocked out 9 NVA soldiers assaulting his position. While moving to grab more ammunition, he saw a grenade land among a cluster of severely wounded men who couldn't move. Barnes threw himself on it. The blast tore through him. He reportedly cried out that he was going to die and asked someone to tell his mother he loved her. He was 20 years old. His battalion commander, Schumacher, initially refused to endorse the Medal of Honor recommendation, saying he didn't believe medals were for men who committed suicide. Barnes received the Medal of Honor anyway. By mid-November, the pattern was clear. American units moved into the hills on foot, hit fortified NVA positions under dense canopy, and took heavy casualties while firepower was largely neutralized. The 173rd had already lost 79 killed and 287 wounded, and the defining battle hadn't even started. U.S. intelligence tracked the fresh 174th NVA Regiment as it slipped west past Ben Het and dug in on an 875-meter hill 6 kilometers from the Cambodian border. The 174th was covering the withdrawal of the battered 66th and 32nd Regiments, pulling back into their sanctuaries across the border. 2,000 NVA regulars in fortified bunkers on commanding terrain under triple canopy. They had interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered mortar positions, and overhead cover thick enough to withstand anything short of a direct hit. Schweiter was told the hill was held by remnants of the already beaten 66th Regiment. That intelligence was wrong. On the morning of November 19, 1967, at the base of Hill 875 near Dak To, Chaplain Charles Waters celebrated Mass. He was a major assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, 40 years old. He'd already completed 1 tour and volunteered for a second. He set up his altar on C-ration boxes. The turnout was large, Catholic and Protestant troopers alike. Robert Fleming, Delta Company's radio operator, remembered the crowd and said everyone knew what they were getting into that day. John Berry, also of Delta Company, later recalled that Waters was unusually slow and deliberate that morning, nothing like his typical fast-talking East Coast manner. At 0943, 3 companies of 2 503rds, roughly 330 men, moved into jump-off positions and started up the north slope of Hill 875. Charlie and Delta companies led in the classic 2-up, 1-back formation. Alpha Company trailed, providing rear security. They made it partway up before the 174th NVA Regiment opened fire from prepared positions above and on both flanks. Machine guns, mortars, recoilless rifles, rifle grenades. Charlie and Delta couldn't advance and couldn't withdraw. The NVA had let them walk deep into the kill zone before triggering the ambush. The non-coms kept shouting at the men to get up the hill, keep moving, keep pushing. They couldn't. Fire was coming from every direction. The paratroopers were shooting in all directions at once, trying to locate bunkers, trying to find cover on a slope that offered none. Then the NVA hit Alpha Company from behind. The 2 503rds were surrounded on 3 sides, pinned halfway up a hill, taking fire from above and below, with no landing zones for medevac and no way to break contact. Marking smoke barely rose above the treetops. Purple, yellow, and green smoke drifted up through the canopy, and the pilots overhead couldn't tell who was who. Men on Hill 823, watching the fight unfold, could hear the continuous roar of gunfire and explosions, could see the smoke curling above the jungle, and could do nothing about it. Chaplain Waters moved through it all. He ran outside the perimeter at least 5 times, unarmed, dragging wounded men back to the aid station. He administered last rites to the dying. He carried a paratrooper, standing in shock directly in front of the advancing NVA, picked the man up on his shoulders and brought him back. At 18:58 that evening came one of the worst friendly fire incidents of the entire war. A Marine Corps A-4 Skyhawk, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Tabor from a Marine Air Group at Chu Lai, dropped 2 250-pound Mark 81 Snake Eye bombs. One detonated as a tree burst directly above the center of the American perimeter, right where the combined command groups, the wounded, and the medics were concentrated. 42 Americans killed instantly, 45 more wounded. Captain Harold Kaufman, the overall on-scene commander, among the wounded. Alpha Company's commander already dead from the fighting on the slope. First Lieutenant Bartholomew O'Leary, commanding Delta Company, seriously wounded. Chaplain Waters was on his knees giving last rites to a dying paratrooper when the bomb hit. He was killed instantly. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of only 7 chaplains in American history to receive it. The survivors dug in among shattered timber, and the dead, NVA mortar and sniper fire continued through the night. Water was gone. Ammunition running low, the medics worked by feel in the dark, tying off tourniquets, pushing morphine into men whose wounds they couldn't see. The smell of napalm, cordite, blood, vomit, and decomposing flesh mixed into something survivors said burned permanently into their memory. Medic Earl Jackson later described what stayed with him longest. Severely wounded men almost always became delirious, he said, and they almost always cried out for their mothers. Dawn on November 20th revealed a landscape no survivor could forget. The jungle had been turned into a cratered waste of splintered trees and scorched earth. Abandoned weapons, helmets, rucksacks, canteens, and sea ration containers scattered everywhere among the dead. November 20th, the 3 companies of 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry set out to reach the trapped 2 503rds. NVA snipers and mortar fire made progress agonizingly slow. It took the entire day to cover what should have been a short march. Before the relief column could reach the perimeter, Private First Class Carlos Lozada, a machine gunner from Alpha Company 2 503rds, was manning a 4-man early warning outpost 35 meters forward of the company lines. Born in Caguas, Puerto Rico, 21 years old, he'd been in Vietnam since June. At 1400, he spotted an NVA company moving down a well-defined trail toward the perimeter, 10 meters away when he opened fire. His M60 cut down at least 20 NVA soldiers in the first burst, disrupting the assault before it could develop. His comrades begged him to pull back. Lozada saw what they couldn't. If he left, nothing stood between the NVA and the rest of Alpha Company. The entire company withdrawal would collapse. The NVA were converging from 3 sides, meters away. Lozada stood from his covered position and fired his M60 from the hip, walking rounds into the advancing enemy until they killed him. His comrades had to carry his body during the withdrawal. Carlos Lozada received the Medal of Honor. Bravo Company of the 4 503rds finally reached the perimeter by dusk. 2 more companies came in after dark, carrying food and water to men who'd been fighting for over 30 hours. On November 21st, both battalions pushed for the crest. The fighting was close enough to see faces. Paratroopers and NVA soldiers threw grenades at each other across distances measured in feet. Some Sky soldiers fought into the NVA trench line itself. Close quarters combat with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. They were ordered to pull back at nightfall. That night, the 4th Infantry Division's 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry, was pulled from the southern Central Highlands and redeployed to Dak To in a nighttime air movement. Chinooks flew through the dark, carrying an entire battalion. In less than 12 hours, the 112th Infantry had repositioned around the main fire support base, ready to hit Hill 875 from the south. November 22nd was given over to firepower. Everything the Americans had was directed at that hilltop. air strikes, B-52 arc light strikes, and a sustained artillery barrage that went on for hours. What had been triple canopy forest on Hill 875 was reduced to charred stumps and cratered moonscape. On November 23, 1967, Thanksgiving Day, the 2nd and 4th Battalions of the 503rd Infantry assaulted from the north, while the 112th Infantry hit from the south. The paratroopers who went up that morning had been fighting for 4 days. They were dehydrated, exhausted, many still in the line because there was nobody left to replace them. Chaplain John Torp of the 4th Battalion held services in the wreckage of brush and shattered trees before the final push, dipping wafers in wine and handing them to tired soldiers who filed past. They reached the crest. The NVA were gone. A few dozen charred bodies among the wreckage of bunkers, abandoned weapons. Abandoned weapons. The 174th Regiment had pulled back into Cambodia during the night, leaving behind a hill that no longer had any vegetation, any tactical value, or any reason for anyone to hold it. The numbers from Hilly 875 alone are staggering. The two 503rds lost 87 killed, 130 wounded, 3 missing. The 4 503rds lost 28 killed, 123 wounded, 4 missing. Of the 570 Sky soldiers who fought on that hill, 340 became casualties. 60% of every man who went up the slope. Combined with all the fighting around Dak To from November through the 23rd, total American losses were 376 killed or missing and 1,441 wounded. The 173rd Airborne Brigade accounted for the bulk of those numbers. The fighting had consumed 1/5 of the brigade's total strength. The munitions expenditures alone tell you how desperate the fighting was. 151,000 artillery rounds fired, 2,096 tactical air sorties, 257 B-52 arc-light strikes, all of it for hills that were abandoned within days. 3 Medal of Honor recipients came from Dak To, all posthumous: Barnes, Waters, Lozada. The 173rd was pulled off the line and sent to Tui Ho and then Camp Radcliffe at An Khe to refit. The brigade that had arrived in Vietnam as the first major army ground unit, the outfit that had made the only combat jump of the war, was now combat ineffective. Westmoreland declared Dak To a victory. He said the NVA had been soundly defeated without unduly sacrificing operations in other areas. He'd actually been in Washington while Hill 875 was being fought, giving an optimistic speech at the National Press Club about how well the war was going. While his paratroopers were dying under friendly bombs in Kontum province, the commanding general was telling the American public that the end was beginning to come into view. Like so much of the quantified, body count-driven assessment of the war, the official story bore little relation to what had actually happened on the ground. Major General Charles Stone, who replaced Pears at the 4th Infantry Division in January 1968, had a different assessment entirely. He couldn't even get anyone to show him where Hill 875 was on a map. It had no strategic value, he said later. No people, no resources, no real growing areas. The NVA held all those mountains along the border, and it made no difference because the mountains controlled nothing worth controlling. The enemy suffered a horrible malaria rate up there. Why go out and fight them where every advantage was on their side? But the strategic picture was even worse than Stone's tactical critique suggested. The border battles at Dak To, Con Thien, Loc Ninh, and Song Bay achieved exactly what Hanoi intended. By January 1968, half of all U.S. maneuver battalions in South Vietnam had been drawn away from the cities and lowlands and repositioned along the borders. 3 of the 4 NVA regiments that fought at Dak To were too battered to participate in what came next. But the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the unit Westmoreland counted on as his fire brigade, wasn't available either. They were rebuilding in the rear, filling the gaps left by the men they'd buried across those ridgelines. The stage was set for Tet. The brigade would come back. They'd fight in Binh Dinh province, the Bong Son Plain, the coastal lowlands. They wouldn't leave Vietnam until 1971, but the Central Highlands in 1967 marked them permanently. Over 6,000 Purple Hearts across the entire war. More than 1,700 dead by the time it was over. Father Waters was buried at Arlington. Carlos Lozada is at Long Island National Cemetery. John Barnes rests in a grave bearing the Medal of Honor insignia. His own battalion commander tried to deny him.